Well, this morning we are beginning a 4-week series called Jesus, Love, and the LGBTQ Community. Before we jump in, though, I want to tell you two things to maybe just kind of set the stage for this. First, I want to tell you that, doing a series like this is not really my first choice. I know that it's controversial. I know that some people who will see it online, in fact, some people have already been seeing it online, and sending us all kinds of corrective messages and telling us all kinds of things, and so I want you to know none of this is about being sensationalistic. I'm teaching on it because it's been a hard topic for Christians and churches, and we need help sorting it out. And I think if we're honest, whatever we might think in terms of details on these kinds of questions, I think if we're honest and we look back over the history of the church, at least in my adult life, we would have to say that the church has most of the time not done very well with this topic, especially in its net effect of its treatment of people. So I know that those who have harshly judged people in the gay community, for example, and made them unwelcome in churches, I know that they've often done that out of a desire to be faithful to God. I get that. And I'm glad that God is so gracious. I think He smiles on our faithfulness, even when we get some things right and some things wrong. And I'm talking about me, I'm talking about all of us, because we all do get some things right and some things wrong. So I'm glad God is gracious as we all try to be faithful and figure these things out. But we also have to acknowledge that just because we're sincere and we're trying to be faithful doesn't necessarily mean we've automatically gotten to the right answer about something. We only have to think of Christian slaveholders in the South or Catholic Christians in the time of the Crusades to understand that we can be sincere and also be sincerely wrong. And we just need to understand that's possible, which makes the questions important. So even where we differ on a topic like this as Christians, and Christians really do differ on these kinds of topics these days, I would say to all of us this: let's not get tricked into accusing each other of unfaithfulness. Instead, let's all agree that we need to be willing to explore the sometimes difficult questions that are in front of us. Almost all of us now have a friend or a family member who is gay or who is otherwise a part of the LGBTQ community. So it's not just a question anymore that can be ignored. And I think anyone who looks closely at the last 40 years knows that it's a question that in the church we've often handled poorly. So second, I just want to tell you how we got to today, in this church, how we got to today. My confession to you, which I always say a little bit tongue-in-cheek these days, is that as a pastor, I've very successfully dodged this issue for over 25 years. Quite proud of that, really. I'm joking. But, for 25 years, people would say, "What about?" And I'd be like, "I got to go get a coffee," because it's been such a hard topic and because I only knew what I had been taught also. But a few years ago, when some gay folks began attending our church, some other folks in our church were very vocal with me about wanting those people to leave. And neither I nor our eldership team thought that this was what Jesus would do, that Jesus would say to people, "Yeah, you're not welcome here. Everybody else is, but not you." And those events that happened, and some of you have been around here a long time, you know what I'm talking about, but those events that happened, they started a couple years of Crux, which is our little theological think tank here at LifeSpring. They started a couple years of Crux beginning to read and discuss our way through these topics. And that included an evening where we had some gay friends and some parents who have raised gay kids come and share with that group and just tell their stories, which was a pretty moving evening for a lot of us, because here's the thing. And by the way, one of those friends who came was my brother-in-law, who's gay and who is a very, very good friend of mine. And here's the thing. When you know people and you know what they've been through, what you realize is this is not just an issue. This is people. This is people, their lives, their hard things, their journeys, how they have wrestled, in this case, with their sexuality and their sexual identity across the years of their life. And we sometimes just say, "Oh, it's this issue and here's my opinion," as if this is not a thing that has been extremely difficult for large numbers of people to navigate in their lives. Anyway, so about 9 weeks ago, today, about 9 weeks ago, we had our elders and our strategic team and the members of our Crux community sitting on the Lehman screen porch for an evening together of just kind of checking in with, like, where are we in this process? We've been at this for almost a couple of years, talking about these things, so where are we? How's everybody feeling about the process? How's everybody feeling about where we should be going as a church? What is the next step for us? And it was obvious that all of us were leaning more toward including people in our church community rather than doing what most churches, frankly, have been doing, which is excluding people and treating people as unwelcome. So, as that was kind of becoming apparent in our conversation, I asked the group where they thought this process goes from here. Kind of said to this group of our leaders, so where does this go from here? And what they actually suggested was that we let you, all of you, hear some of the stories that we got to hear. And so over the next couple of weeks, over the next 2 Sundays, I'm going to be sitting up here not preaching, but doing interviews so that you can hear people's real stories in their lives. In my mind, very brave real stories, people who are really willing to sit up here and open up to you guys. But this morning, so that's what we're going to do over the next 2 weeks. We want you to hear the stories of real people. But this morning, because all the Christian arguments against gay people are made using a handful of Bible verses, I'm going to teach through those passages with you. I just don't think there's any way around the fact, because that's the number one argument is people say, well, you know, the Bible says. So with you together this morning, I want us to ask, well, what does the Bible say? What do we actually find there? So a lot of people are surprised to learn that if you search all 31,000 and some verses of the Bible, you will find 5 or 6 passages that potentially touch on this question. It's also interesting that no English translation of the Bible actually used the word homosexual until 1946. In the early 1940s, the translation committee of the Revised Standard Version, right? Like, this is a New King James Version. You have all these different Bible translations, right? So they were creating a Bible called the Revised Standard. There had been the Standard Version, and they were creating the Revised Standard Version in the early 1940s. And they were going through figuring out how are we going to translate all these different Greek words in the New Testament. And a seminary student wrote to one of the members of the committee and said, I heard that you guys are going to use the word homosexual in these 2 passages, and I would encourage you to take a harder look at the Greek and also to go back and double down on your study of why previous English Bible translators have not used this word. Why they've said, no, that's not really accurate, or we really don't know enough, or whatever. And the member of the committee that the seminary student wrote back and said, I will make sure that that word is not translated that way. But for whatever reason, it was. When the Revised Standard Version came out in 1946, for the first time, an English translation of the Bible actually had the word homosexual in it. And over the years following, once that door was opened, a number of different English translations followed suit and did the same thing. What's very telling, though, is that when the Revised Standard Version was revised, which is sort of funny, but when the Revised Standard Version was revised in 1971, they took it back out. They said, we made a mistake in 1946. The passage that is usually brought up first in this conversation is a story you probably all know. It's the story of the destruction of the city of Sodom in Genesis chapter 19. And you may remember that the way the story goes is that Abraham, a major figure in the Old Testament, Abraham's nephew Lot makes room in his home for 2 overnight guests, men who are revealed later in the story to be angels. And the people of the city surround Lot's house, demanding that he send these 2 men outside so that they can abuse them sexually. And the assumption is that gay sex is at the center of the story. There's 2 men in this house, the people of the city. It actually doesn't say the men of the city. It says the people of the city. But the people of the city surround, and they say, hey, send these men out so that we can have our way with them. And so everybody, lots of people look at this passage, and they say, oh, this passage is about gay sex. But clearly it isn't. Because Lot's response to the crowd is to offer them his daughters instead. If Lot thought this was about gay sex, he would not say, no, take my daughters instead, because he would know, well, that's surely not going to work. And yet that's how the story unfolds. We also know this is not the meaning of the story, not what's at the center of the story, because Jewish scholars in all the centuries afterwards, all the millennia afterwards, have never read the story that way, and this is their scripture. They've never read the story that way. And the prophet Ezekiel, hundreds of years later, tells us that Sodom was destroyed not for homosexuality, but for its sins of pride and not caring for the poor. And scholars tell us that in ancient times, aggression against outsiders was common in communities that had limited resources. In other words, we don't like strangers in our community because strangers in our community eat our food, want to sleep in our beds, want to take our daughters away. So absolutely not. So the biblical story about Sodom really has nothing to do with this particular topic. That is, of all the passages, this is the easiest one to just sort of say, yeah, no. The only other Old Testament passages that mention homosexual acts are found in the book of Leviticus in chapters 18 and 20. And I'm just going to read to you from Leviticus chapter 18, just a couple of verses. Leviticus 18, beginning in verse 22. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Nor shall you mate with any animal to defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion. So, obviously the passage references homosexual acts. There's no debate about that in a very direct way. But that's not the only thing it mentions. The verses right after this are actually prohibitions about having sex with animals. And I know as modern people we kind of go, so what's up with that? Why does that rule even have to be given? And while what is termed zoophilia was actually much more common in the ancient world than it is now, it's also very interesting that the verse that precedes these two verses sets them in the context of pagan idolatry. This is the verse right before what I read to you. And you shall not let any of your descendants, i.e. your children, pass through the fire to the god Molech. So, across much of Israel's history in the Old Testament, we find God warning his people not to imitate their neighbors by getting involved in idolatry, and several times warning his people not to imitate their neighbors, other nations around them, by offering their children as literal child sacrifices in the flames to these pagan gods. And Jeremiah tells us, the prophet Jeremiah tells us later, that the nation of Israel actually fell into a season where they were actually sacrificing their children to pagan gods. In fact, they did it. If you remember some of the stuff I've preached about hell and Gehenna and the valley of Hinnom outside Jerusalem, that's where they did it, in the valley of Hinnom outside Jerusalem. We also know that both homosexual acts and those involving animals were part of ritual temple worship in ancient cultures. For example, the Canaanite deity Baal was often portrayed as a man with the head of a bull. One of the features of ancient pagan worship was that worshipers would honor their gods by acting out what they wanted their gods to do that would then bring about the result that the worshiper wanted. So, for example, Baal was the god of fertility, and it was believed that when Baal had sexual relations with his wife, that then that caused fertility to be showered down upon his worshipers, meaning that their crops would be good. There would be rain, and the ground would be fertile, and they'd get a good crop that season. And so what you would do as a worshiper is you would mimic the act that you wanted your gods to do so that they would then they would shower out the blessing that you were hoping for. So because the god Baal was part animal, you can put the rest together. You had to mimic the act in order to get the result. That sounds crazy to us as modern people. We go, seriously? Like people did this? Yes, people did this. Linda and I were on a walk the other night, and I was describing this to her because I was working on this sermon, and so we were talking about this. I was describing this to her, and thinking back to growing up in a liturgical church, and I was saying this is what people would do to get their gods to act, and Linda said, I'd rather just light a candle. So, but the ancient world was a different place. I think we forget that when we read parts of the Bible. The ancient world was a different place. Now, do we know that this is the historical and religious context for these verses in Leviticus? We really don't completely, but the fact that these prohibitions come right after references to idolatrous pagan worship, it does strongly suggest it. One of the most conservative evangelical scholars I know, Robert Gagnon, has said that this is certainly the backdrop of the references to homosexuality in Leviticus. So I would add, before we leave, while we're here messing around with Leviticus, I would just add two other thoughts. First, people in the time that Leviticus was written, perhaps as early as 1400 BC, they had no concept of what we see around us today. People born with same-gender sexual desires in mutually consenting, loving relationships. So this is certainly not what the ancient world didn't think in those terms. And so this is not what the writer is speaking to. We may have some lack of clarity about what exactly he's addressing, but it's definitely not what we see around us today. And second, I would just suggest that I think we need to be very careful about trying to apply the edicts in a book like Leviticus to modern life. Leviticus says that you can't eat pork, you can't wear clothing with mixed fibers. Some of you are sitting here today and you got a shirt or dress that's half cotton, half polyester. You're going to hell for that. I mean, you can't wear mixed, cloth of mixed fibers, and you should stone your disobedient children. So listen up, kids. Listen up, kids. It's going to get tough. But seriously, it even gives very detailed parameters for which insects you can eat. Listen to this. Leviticus chapter 11. All flying insects that creep on all fours shall be an abomination to you. But you may eat of every flying insect that creeps on all fours, but has jointed legs above its feet. These you may eat, the locust after its kind, the destroying locust after its kind, the cricket after its kind, and the grasshopper after its kind. But all other flying insects which have 4 feet shall be an abomination to you. So your half rack of ribs and your shrimp scampi dinner are out. The good news is that the locusts and the grasshoppers are in. So, you have to be careful. My point is, don't just ignore the ancient context and pick and choose some verses from Leviticus and say, oh, we can apply these easily to modern life. If that doesn't tell you you're talking about things written in a different world, I don't know. Okay, so that's all there is in the Old Testament. So there are 3 passages in the New Testament which come up in the conversation about same-gender relationships. The first of those is in Paul's letter to the church at Rome, and I'm going to read you 8 verses from chapter 1 of that letter. It's a little bit long, but I think you can handle it. But it would be disingenuous of me not to read you the passage, so I want to read that to you. It starts in Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in their unrighteousness, because what may be known about God has been made manifest to them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible qualities are clearly seen, being understood by the things that have been made, even his eternal power and his deity, so that men are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made to look like corruptible man, and images of birds and 4-footed animals and creeping things. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. Those who exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to vile passions. For even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error. So, this is seemingly the least ambiguous of the New Testament texts that mentions homosexuality, simply because it undoubtedly mentions homosexual acts. Among those who take a conservative position on these issues, it's also considered the indisputable proof that God condemns all gay relationships. But again, we have to ask some probing questions about the context, and when we do, there are interesting things that come to light, and I want to share 3 of those with you. The first is that it's clear that Paul is connecting these homosexual acts to literal pagan idolatry, and very possibly, as is probable back in Leviticus, homosexual acts that are part of the rites going on in pagan temples. So again, Paul isn't just saying, let me give you my opinion on gay people. Paul begins to talk about idolatry, and we know he's talking about literal idolatry because he literally mentions they knew God at one point, human beings did, but now people are worshiping these images, these statues is what he means, that look like people and animals and birds and creeping things. And so we know there's this connection to idolatry. This isn't just sort of a thing about, gay people. Second, Paul uses a really curious Greek phrase in describing these homosexual acts. The Greek phrase is paraphysin, and it literally translates as against nature. And so people sometimes read it and they say, that's right, these gay relationships are against nature. Or as some translations render the phrase, unnatural. But here's what you don't know, just picking up your English translation Bible and reading it. Josephus, a Jewish historian, and Philo, a Jewish philosopher, both of them writing at the same time as Paul, they use this phrase in their writings, paraphysin, and they use it in only one very specific way. They use it to describe sexual acts, including heterosexual acts, that are wrong because they avoid procreation. They avoid the bearing of children or the conceiving of children. So many in the ancient world, many people in the ancient world, perhaps most of the ancient world, actually believed that the only purpose of sex was to conceive children, period. If Paul is using the phrase the way Josephus and Philo did, then what he's referring to is people pursuing sexual pleasure, whether heterosexual or homosexual, with the intention of avoiding conceiving children, and that would be one reason Paul would see it negatively. Because this is not the sex that leads to children, this is the sex that doesn't lead to children. If Paul did hold that view, that childbearing is the only purpose of sexual intimacy, most of us would probably disagree with him today on that, and say that there is more than one purpose for sexuality in God's design, and for sexual intimacy in God's design. But this probably explains what Paul means by the phrase against nature because it avoids conception, because it avoids procreation. Then there's this third very interesting thing that you would never know, and I didn't know until a couple years ago. You would never know this just picking up the Bible and reading it in English, which is why probably the New Testament writers should have been the guys who wrote the commentaries. By the way, when I'm writing this, here's what I'm talking about, but they didn't do that. Much of what Paul writes in Romans 1, he lifts word for word out of a book called the Book of Wisdom. He picks it up and plops it right into his writing. Not in a plagiarism way, everybody knows he's quoting it, but you don't because you're a 21st century English reader who doesn't know the Book of Wisdom, right? Also known as the Wisdom of Solomon, the Book of Wisdom is in the Jewish, Catholic, and Orthodox Bibles as part of the Old Testament. It's not in the Protestant Bible. It's part of what Protestants refer to as the Apocrypha that was not included in the Protestant Old Testament. What Paul quotes verbatim from the Book of Wisdom is these descriptions of the sinfulness of human beings, but not just any human beings, non-Jews, Gentiles. The Book of Wisdom rails about human sinfulness, and its whole point is to say to Jewish readers, see, we aren't like those Gentiles. We're the good people, they're the bad people. They're the really sinful people, we're God's holy people. This was all the deal with the Book of Wisdom in this section of it. And so Paul takes these verses from the Book of Wisdom, he drops them into his letter. The Book of Wisdom was read in all the synagogues. So his readers, a first century Jewish reader reading Romans 1 goes, oh, this is from the Book of Wisdom. They would know that. You and I don't know that. So they're reading this stuff from the Book of Wisdom, and Paul leads his readers in Romans 1 down the same well-worn trail describing all the terrible pagan Gentile sins. And then in Romans 2:1, he says to his Jewish readers, oh, hang on. But you who judge those Gentiles so harshly, don't you do the same things? It's a sting operation. It's a sting operation. He's trying to communicate to his Jewish readers The law will not save you. Thinking that you are better than other people will not save you. The only thing that will save you is actually what the whole rest of Romans is about, which is this: the grace that has come to us in Jesus Christ. That's the only thing. That's the thing that you really need. So what this shows is that the point of Romans 1 is not a discussion of homosexuality, but the truth that all people need the grace of God, that God has extended to us in Jesus Christ, that will rescue us and make us new. There's one more thing I want to, and I know I'm trying to fit a lot in this morning. Are you tired yet? Good. You ate your Wheaties this morning? You're ready to go? Okay. There's one more thing about this passage before we leave Romans 1 that I want to tell you that escapes most readers, and that's this. The language of the text is very clear that what Paul is actually describing is people he considers to be heterosexual who are now engaged in homosexual acts because their highly inflamed lust can no longer be sated by heterosexual acts. He's not saying there's these gay people and that's a problem. What he's saying is there are these people who were just like everybody else, but now they're doing these homosexual things. They're doing these acts probably in pagan temple worship because their way of life has led to this inflammation of their lust and they can't be satisfied by what used to satisfy them. And so now they've gone further to this other thing. So if your gay family members and friends are actually heterosexual and their lusts have become so inflamed through their involvement in pagan idol worship that they can now only be satisfied by same-gender sexual relations, then this passage applies to them. But that doesn't describe any of my gay friends and family members. Not one. So we probably should stop bludgeoning them with Romans chapter 1. The other two passages in the New Testament that come into this conversation are found in two of Paul's other letters, in 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1. They're often discussed together because they are similar lists of sinful acts. In both of those letters, to both of those chapters of those letters, Paul is basically saying, here are the acts of the flesh. Here's all this sinful stuff that human beings have been chasing. And the two passages are often discussed together. You can look them up because they use the same Greek word. And when I described to you earlier how the 1946 Revised Standard Version was the first English Bible to use the word homosexual, these are the two passages they were translating, where they wrestled with this one Greek word and said, well, how do you translate this? The Greek word Paul uses is the word arsenokoidai. It's a compound, as many words in Greek are, made out of two other words. Arsenos, which means male, a man specifically, and koidai, which means bed and is a euphemism for some kind of sexual activity. The problem is that we don't really know what this Greek word exactly means. If you say, well, Pastor Fran, do we know that this word is sexual? Yes, that's the koidai part. We know that it's sexual, but we don't know exactly what it means. It doesn't appear in any preserved Greek literature, even outside the Bible, before Paul's use of it. So if you look at every Greek manuscript from antiquity that's ever been discovered, and there's a lot, the first place this word shows up is Paul's letters in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. Doesn't mean he made up the word, just means we haven't come across any other documents that used it before him. It's a big question mark. And it does appear, however, in lots of Greek religious and literary works in the centuries after Paul. 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, 6th century. And it's used in all that other literature after Paul to describe a wide variety of sexual acts, including some that are heterosexual. So that's confusing. So then you go, okay, so then if we double back to Paul, we go back to Paul, we say, well, how was Paul using it? We say, well, we don't know because it was used in a wide variety of ways. So how was Paul using it? No one knows. Exactly. Is it sexual? Yes. Does anybody know exactly what Paul meant by it? No. And to be honest, conservative scholars seize on this word and make an argument that it proves their points, and progressive scholars seize on this word and make the argument that it proves their points. And the reason both of them can do it so easily is simply because nobody really knows. Paul didn't give us a footnote. Here's what we do know. Most of the time when arsenokoidai was used in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries after Paul, it was a reference to sexual acts that were somehow economically exploitative. This explains why the Latin Vulgate, translated in the 400s, rendered Paul's use of arsenokoidae as male prostitutes, because everybody knew this is sex for money in whatever shape that sex is taking. This makes sense in Paul's passages too, because in the 1 Corinthians passage, he uses another Greek word alongside it. He uses this word malakoi. And malakoi literally translates as effeminate. And after Paul, malakoi, well, actually in Paul's time and after Paul, that word had a very specific meaning. It was almost always used to refer to very young men, early teenage men, who made themselves look like women to sell themselves as prostitutes primarily to heterosexual men. Right? It's also interesting that the arsenos part of arsenokoidae, arsenos male, koidae bed, the arsenos part is distinctly male because there was no Greek word in that time just for homosexual. Like we say homosexual, that could be a man, that could be a woman. There was no word like that in Greek. So when Paul says arsenokoidae, whatever it is he's talking about specifically has to do with men, not women, which makes sense because the three kinds of homosexual acts most visible in the first century Greco-Roman culture only involved men. This is what they were. There was male prostitution, again, largely taken advantage of by heterosexual men. Since in Greek culture, I don't know if you know this, in Greek culture, prepubescent boys were considered the height of feminine beauty. Why do you think you see all those statues of very young Greek men looking very beautiful? If you were an older Greek man, you said, who is the hottest chick on the planet? It's not a chick. It's a young boy, because that was just how, now today we go, that's a problem. But that was Greek culture. Second, there was the fact that slave owners could legally have forced sex with their slaves, and those were men who had the right to do that. And then lastly, there was the common and legal practice of pederasty, which was where wealthy men would take in young boys who were poor, and they would provide them with a home and food and clothing and the opportunity for education and the opportunity to get exposed to higher culture and make their way into society. And they would do this in exchange for sexual involvement with that young boy or that young man. Now today, we would put those men in jail. But that was a legal arrangement in the Roman Empire. So, do we know how Paul exactly uses this word in these two letters? No. Is it highly likely he's referring to people involved in economically exploitative sexual relationships? It's extremely highly likely. And if that's the case, he's not talking about your gay friend or family member or coworker who is wired with same-gender attraction and is in or is seeking a loving and consensual relationship of equals. He's talking about sexual relationships where power and exploitation are the word of the day. Okay, that's a lot, right? Feel like you've been on a whirlwind tour? We've been from Leviticus to 1 Timothy in 30 minutes. So have you had your fill of history and linguistics this morning? I kind of have. This is my first choice about how to preach a sermon. In the last few years, I've read somewhere around 2,000 pages of scholarly research and commentary on these 5 verses because I had to know. And I still would say I'm not the world's expert on these things. But I share these things with you this morning because the Christian landscape is still filled with people running around wielding these 5 or 6 Bible passages, and 99% of those people do not know the things that I just shared with you. The reality is that there are things we can know about these passages, and there are things we can't know. My conclusion after several years of study is that none of these passages are talking about your gay friends and family members. Those of us who feel called to be more inclusive in the church are often accused of not taking the Bible seriously. But I would push back on that this morning and suggest that those who use these passages against gay folks have not read the Bible and studied it deeply enough. In some ways, this sermon is a long way of saying that if you're trying to figure out what you think morally about your gay friends and family members, I don't think the Bible is going to help you with that a lot, except in the sense that the New Testament would suggest that all our intimate sexuality should be lived out in sacred covenantal relationships, what we call marriage. But in terms of male, female, all these things, I don't think the Bible is going to give you a simple answer to that question. Now, maybe that bothers you because you think the Bible should answer every question you could possibly ask, which is sort of one of our interesting things we do as modern people, right? We have this book that's literally been written over thousands of years by people in all these different cultures, in all these different languages, and then we show up and we say, I don't really care what you guys were setting out to write, I have some questions. Could you answer those for me? They were not thinking about your questions when they were writing these things down. They were thinking about trying to navigate what God and life meant and how to figure that out as they went along. But if you feel bad because the Bible won't answer every question simply, don't feel bad. The Bible didn't help people in the 1860s figure out slavery either. It didn't. In fact, quite the contrary. Ultimately, the Bible has been given to lead us not to the answer to every little question we have. The Bible has been given to lead us to the ultimate revelation of the good and wise and beautiful God in Jesus Christ, so that we can find the way to real life in Him. So here is the question. If the Bible does not provide an easy answer to this question, what do you do? Because that's, I think, where we find ourselves. And I think the answer to that is that you have to ask other questions. And I would suggest that, specifically, you have to ask some questions about the origin of sexual desire. You know, in the 1980s, I was listening to James Dobson and everybody else tell me that nobody's born gay, and every gay person just woke up in the morning and decided they want to do the biggest act of rebellion and flip God off, and that's why they're gay. And now we all know that's not true. Because 1 million scientific studies have been done, 1 million interviews have been done on people's sexual journeys, and we go, oh, yeah, that wasn't really true, was it? So we have to ask some questions about the origin of sexual desire. I think we have to ask some questions about what it means to see people as human in their entirety and not just look at people through one characteristic, which is funny because we do that with this group of people, but we don't do it with most other groups of people. Like we say, it's like we filter people at the door, right? Like, oh, you have this character, this one thing disqualifies you. You could have a million other different things in your life. We'd say, oh, come on in. Yeah, we welcome everybody. But this one thing becomes this great filtering thing. So we have to ask some questions about what it means to see people as human in their entirety. We have to ask some questions about the kinds of things Jesus actually came to do and change in us, in human beings. You can talk about topics like this so vociferously that after you talk it to death for 6 hours, you start to think like, this is what Jesus came to do, is change people's sexuality. Well, the New Testament has all kinds of things to say about what Jesus came to do, and none of them are focused in on people's sexuality. They're all focused in on things here that then change who we are out here. And then perhaps most importantly, I think we have to ask questions about what love, especially the way that Jesus lived it, what love might look like. And when I say we need to ask questions, what I'm really pointing to is something I've become deeply convinced of, and it's become, I think, very much part of our thinking here at LifeSpring, which is this. And those of you in our Crux community, you're going to be like, I know exactly where he's going. Good theology does not come about because you grab a couple of Bible verses and take your stand on something. We move toward good theology, which just means good thinking about God and life and our faith. We move toward good theology by a combination of things. By listening to Scripture, yes, and listening to wise people, ancient and contemporary. And by holding our answers up against our observation and experience of human existence. Like we can have all kinds of religious ideas, but we have to say, so how does that work out in human life? What does that look like when people try to live it? Or does this idea I have hold true really about human beings? And then by holding all this combination of things up against Jesus, who is the Word that God has spoken and the ultimate revelation of God's heart and nature. So good theology is a process, and it requires humility and learning and conversation and reflection and prayer. It's very easy to just grab a couple of Bible verses that you think you know and wave those around at somebody and say, I got the truth right here. It's another thing to say, I think the Bible teaches whatever, but I'm going to back up and I'm going to wonder about that, pray about it. I'm going to dialogue with good thinkers, ancient and modern. I'm going to study Scripture deeply because I might have read it wrong. That's a whole different thing to say that's how we come to a good view of things. And I would just end my talk this morning by inviting our focus onto one word. And that one word is Jesus. Isn't that what we want, to know Jesus? To know the good and beautiful God that's revealed in him? And isn't this what we want for all our friends and neighbors and coworkers and family members? To know this Jesus who has revealed to us a kind of love that the world has scarcely imagined? Isn't that what we want? And that's all of us, gay and straight, tall and short, brown-eyed, blue-eyed, black, white, and brown, Republican, Democrat, American, Russian, Ukrainian. Isn't this what we want for everyone, that we might be made new and have our humanity and our hope and our joy restored as we are made free and whole and good by the good and wise and beautiful God? Isn't this really what matters? That we are made new in all the deepest and most beautiful ways? But that isn't where we've been living with this issue. And I just want to be honest about that, because I can end this sermon with lots of beautiful words, but this isn't where we've been living. We've been meeting people at the door. We've been filtering them out based on these things. And we've been saying, yes, we want everyone to find all the wonderful things in God, and we want to help everyone except you. Yeah, not you. You're disqualified. And when I read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, this is not the Jesus I discover there. In fact, I've said, and by the way, don't judge this whole series on this morning. We're going to talk about a lot of things over the weeks ahead. But I have said this in our leadership team. Why is it we're all as Christians so afraid of condoning somebody's sin, what we think is their sin? And none of us are worried that we don't have as bad a reputation as Jesus for who we hang around with. Jesus had a bad reputation for one simple thing: loving everybody, being with everybody, letting everybody touch him, going to everybody's house, hanging out with everybody. But we never worry that we're not being criticized as much as Jesus for loving. And as my friend Dave Jankowski, who's here this morning and has become part of our church, has said to me more than once, I'm pretty sure that when we get to heaven, the Lord's not going to be mad at us for loving too much. Let's pray.